Hey there, you probably heard about a general rule that states that when you have a position on which you lack space, you need to exchange pieces. If you haven't heard it, don't worry, because this general idea that, as we'll see, doesn't work in all cases, is something that we can easily understand if we use the principles that we learned at the beginning of the course. So remember that when you exchange pieces, you need to focus on the material balance, but also on exchanging your most passive pieces and on the resulting positions that you get after the exchanges. And whenever you have positions on which you don't have enough space, it is very common to have passive pieces. By the way, lacking space or having a space advantage is basically occupying more squares on the board than your opponent, particularly when we occupy space on our opponent's side of the board. So in this position we can see that black's pieces are restricted on black's side of the board, and black only has a few pieces, such as this pawn on c5, controlling some squares on white's camp, whereas white here has a clear space advantage. White has 3 pawns on black's side of the board on the 5th rank, and also this knight is quite good there, controlling the b6 square, the e5 square, and also putting pressure on this pawn on d6. So here white has a clear space advantage. That's why most of white pieces have more space to maneuver. That's why they are normally going to be more active. In this position it is black to play, and black has to do something about this knight on g6 which is being attacked. Let's evaluate some alternatives. First of all, going to h4 is really bad because after bishop to g5 this knight is going to be lost. The knight cannot go anywhere. Going to h8 is a move that is really good because the knight on h8 is going to be very passive. Similarly, going to e7 is a very bad move just from the general point of view, because this knight doesn't have any future so far. The knight cannot go to c6, d5 is very well defended, f5 as well, and additionally we need to evaluate the other pieces, as we know, and this rook on e8 now is being restricted by the knight on e7. So that leaves us with the move knight to e5, which is the move that was played in the game, which makes a lot of sense because the knight is going to a central square, it's improving its placement, and generally speaking black would like to exchange the knight that was on g6 for this knight on c4, which is one of white's best pieces. And in the game white exchanged knights. Now the knight on e5 is quite a good piece, but white could have considered a move like knight to b6, keeping the pieces on the board. So if black, who has a space disadvantage, wants to exchange pieces, white might want to keep pieces, but in this case leaving this knight on e5 is not necessarily good because the knight is very strong there. And here black might continue with this idea of exchanging pieces. For example, knight f to d7, we bring this knight that is going to be attacked soon, and we try to exchange it for the knight on b6. This was an alternative, but exchanging the knight on c4 for the knight on e5 also makes a lot of sense because the knight on e5 now is very strong. And here black took with the rook, which also makes a lot of sense because this rook was placed on the open e-file. That's why taking with the pawn wouldn't be good here. For example, after taking, white can continue with this idea of attacking the knight, and after knight to d7, white can try knight to e4, and we again see how white has a clear space advantage, and black's pieces, they really lack mobility on the 8th rank. So after taking on e5, white continued with bishop to f4, attacking the rook, rook to e8, bishop to f3, and black played a very typical move in this type of positions. Black played the move b5, in fact trying to gain space himself, and b4 is a big threat, that's why white took on b6. And after taking on b6, the pawn structure changed a little bit. One slight disadvantage is that this pawn on e6 is a bit weak, but on the other hand black is gaining more squares for the pieces. Now this rook on b6 is definitely more active, putting pressure there, and the bishop might come either to b7 or even to a6 after playing a5, so we can see that black pieces are better than before. In the game white continued with g5, knight to d7, this knight is going to come to e5, and after bishop to c1 defending the pawn, black continued with rook to b4, knight to e2, knight to e5, bishop to g2, a5, now planning to bring the bishop to a6, and we still get a complicated position, but we see that at least black has gained some space after these exchanges, and black even managed to win this game. So since the side lacking space will try to exchange pieces, the side having a space advantage will normally try to keep pieces unless there is a clear tactical idea to win material. In this position here, white has this knight on f5, that might be taken, that's why white decided to move the knight. So here white has a great position, white has a space advantage, white has better pieces, and white decided not to take the bishop on g7. White played the move knight to h4, that we'll analyze later, and the main idea is that taking on g7 would remove some pieces from the board, and after king takes, black still has a very bad position because black has all of the pieces on the 8th rank, but at least now, having less pieces, has more squares to maneuver. Now the square f7 is available, for example, and black might try to improve her pieces, for example playing the move rook to b7, and then bring it to f7. This knight might come to h7, eyeing this pawn. This rook might come to f8. So now black has more space to maneuver than before. That's why exchanging pieces would make life easier for black, and white decided to play the move knight to h4. And black is really cramped in this position. The game continued queen to e7, queen to h2, knight to c7. This knight is still very useless there because it doesn't have any future, it cannot come to e6. Rook to f1, king to e8. And here comes a very instructive moment. Whenever we have a space advantage, it is normally okay to keep pieces on the board, but ultimately this is a means to an end. We have this advantage, but we need to convert it in the end. And if that means exchanging pieces, that's okay. So if we see any tactical idea, we can exchange pieces as we saw in the previous section. So here white played the very strong move f4 to activate white's pieces. Black took on f4, otherwise white could also continue with the move f5. And after bishop takes f4, this idea is justified tactically because white is already putting pressure on this pawn on d6. Although now the bishop is becoming more active, black will lose material. So here, white is exchanging pieces in order to gain a material advantage. Black continues with the move king to d7. If black plays bishop to e5, trying to trade pieces, which from a general point of view makes sense, this would fail tactically because after taking on e5 and taking with the pawn or with the queen, white already has this very strong move, rook to f6, attacking the pawn on d6 and the pawn on g6, so we get a fork, and black's position is falling apart. But after king to d7, white played a very strong move, bishop takes d6, and in this position black resigned because black is going to lose a lot of material. The queen and the knight are being attacked, and the main point is that black cannot take the bishop because after rook to f7, we attack the king, the bishop, but more importantly, the king cannot move to e8 because white will simply capture the queen. So following what we learned so far, when having a cramped position, you will normally try to exchange your most passive pieces.